करून घ्या तुम्ही ह्याचं येणं कशावर वाचलं ठरलं आहे ना मनीष आहे का अनाऊन्स करायला लागतं का
अनाऊन्स करावं लागतं मग मृगांक काढणार झालं
सांगितलं ना
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. To begin with, a very warm welcome to our respected speaker, Maroof Raza, a well-known defense expert, media commentator, and a writer. And in continuing with the tradition of Prabodhan Mancha, I will request Shri Madan Vajpayee to please honor him with a shawl, shrifa, and a book. I think another huge round of applause is due because Maroof ji has just been awarded an honorary doctorate by the Amity University for his work in defense and strategic affairs. Congratulations, sir. As mentioned in our message earlier and also displayed outside, Maroof ji has very kindly agreed to autograph his books, which are available outside today as well. We normally don't speak too much about Prabodhan Mancha Parle when we are at this event because you're all our dedicated audience. But again, 853 days, so we thought we'd just give you a small update. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our 25th program. We are now in a new mode because we did 13 in this format, we did 11 online, and today we are in a new format because while all of you are here together with us, we are also live streaming to our audience on YouTube, Facebook, and other medium as well. So now to this new audience and to this new medium, 25th program is a great achievement, we think, for all of us together. Our personal database has crossed 2,400. We have more than 11,100 subscribers on YouTube. But if any one of you is still not registered with us, please do so today. And of course, a big thank you to our 200 plus donors, out of whom 60 have given us repeat contributions. A brief introduction of Maroof ji. Educated in India earlier at the Mayo College, Ajmer, and then Stephens College, Delhi, and subsequently in London from King's College as well as the Cambridge University. Maroof ji joined the Indian Army in 1980 and served with great honor. And while he is today an extremely accomplished and well-renowned speaker and an expert on matters pertaining to strategy and defense, he continues to be involved in many educational activities, and he has also written 3 books which have been very, very well received. He has made it to the Limca Book of Records for absolutely varied reasons, but as I said, the recent accolade of being given an honorary doctorate is the crowning glory. So just as the world relived a 100-year-old tragedy and a phenomenon called pandemic, and we thought we are out of a crisis, we were reminded of a 70-year-old tragedy which might revisit us, a global war. As Russia declared war in the Baltic Plains on Ukraine, global supply chains in food, fertilizer, and energy were completely disrupted. Spiraling inflation and acute shortages seem to be the next crisis. So what are the global challenges that this war has thrown? Importantly, as India demonstrated with multi-alignment, a new strategy slightly different from the earlier one of non-alignment, I believe. And does this create opportunities for India? Well, who better than Maroof ji to enlighten us with this and answer all these and many more questions that you may have. If you have questions, write them down on the back of the entry passes and pass them to our volunteers. With that, over to you, Maroof ji.
I'll manage.
Thank you.
Don't worry. Don't worry. We'll let it be.
Good morning, everybody. Namaskar. And I'm greatly honored to be here amongst you to speak about a subject which has gone now for more than 2 months. The war in Ukraine and its implications for the world and for India. The reason I'm still trying to get my thoughts together to speak on this subject is because so much has been said and written about the subject that it leaves one somewhat a bit challenged as to where you begin and where should you begin with the subject. Now, let me try and put it in context. I'm trying to get myself organized while I speak. I know I have to speak for about 40 odd minutes and I like to keep to time. So you can time your watches and see that I'll finish in 40 minutes and leave it rest to the audience then to follow up with question. Now, there's a lot of material. In fact, I've become habitual of collecting good editorial pieces from newspapers and magazines and constantly going through them again and again and trying to draw out key points that helps fill the gaps on some of the issues. So let me start. Where do I start? You see, President Putin, his decision to go into Ukraine was something that was known to astute observers for some time. It wasn't that on one fine day he got up and decided that this was his ticket to greatness and he should do that. He had been indicating to the world that Russia's patience was running out. As an advocate of the Russian point of view, but I think it's important in any analysis to get both sides of the perspective. So first, why did Russia do it? See, Russia had been driven to the ground after the end of the Cold War. But as one observer, an Indian who teaches in a university in the US wrote, that great powers don't fade away. They don't disappear. And if they have inherent capacity in them, they can always bounce back, which is what Russia has done before the Ukraine conflict. Why? Because the Ukraine conflict has shown Russia in poor light. But it doesn't mean that its inability to influence its agenda on Ukraine shows that Russia is militarily a pushover. It's still a very powerful country. It just implemented a military operation very shoddily. Part of it can be hubris or a sense of excessive self-belief that we will just run over the country in 2 to 3 weeks. Part of it is the fact that the Ukrainian people have rallied together and shown what a people-led resistance can do, what regular armies can't necessarily guarantee a country. And this is a lesson for the rest of the world, particularly for China, which has similar ambitions like Russia. It has a similarly large military force and wants to implement its expansionist agenda on its neighborhood, classically as we have seen in the case of India, and has territorial ambitions that goes historically to areas that China has claimed. Taiwan is a case in point. So what was Russia's claim on Ukraine? In the 9th century, the original Russian Empire came into being from Ukraine. Kiev, actually, it was announced at. And so Putin believes that Russia's ticket to greatness lies with absorbing Ukraine. Part of that is true in a geo-economic sense. And part of it is true in fulfilling a territorial ambition. So somebody once wrote in the last couple of months that without Ukraine, Russia remains a powerful state. But with Ukraine, Russia becomes an empire. For more reasons than one. One of them being Ukraine is Europe's and to a great extent the world's breadbasket. And therefore it provides the kind of grain percentages that can influence decisions worldwide. After all, yes, vehicles run on fuel, and that's what Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries do because they control the percentage of fuel that is produced in the world. And Russia, outside of OPEC countries, and OPEC is really a cartel led by Saudi Arabia, but Russia outside OPEC countries is one of the biggest oil producers, oil and gas producers in the world. So it needed that grain basket itself to have leverage in 2 key areas. One was oil and gas exports. We all have read again and again that 40% of Europe's gas requirements come from Russia, and therefore the sanctions that were imposed on Russia after the intervention have restricted themselves to some areas and not been imposed in the area of the consumption of gas by European countries. So its hypocrisy is evident from day one. The second thing is that controlling Ukrainian grain would have given Russia leverage over Europe and many parts of the world. Most of the world's sunflower oil comes from Ukraine and Russia. And that, as we know, as the housewives would know, is a very important element of the kitchen. So those were also the reasons that Putin wanted Ukraine. Of course, his emotional reasoning being that you rub my nose onto the ground when the Cold War came to an end and the Berlin Wall collapsed, where Putin, as some of you might know, was a young lieutenant colonel in the KGB on the Iron Curtain. He was at a place called Dresden. And he was the last man in your classic Frederick Forsyth, Jean Le Carré move that went out of that town in a last man fighting with an AK-47 and went back with whatever documents he could take. The rest he had burnt off or destroyed so that nothing would come into the hands of the Western world. So he had this anger and grievance against Western-led collapse of the Soviet Empire. He wanted that to be revived. And that's why I made that earlier point. With Ukraine, Russia could become an empire again. Without Ukraine, it will remain an empire in waiting, if I may put it that way. The other thing that happened was that there were 3 or 4 guarantees that were given to the international community by the US, EU, NATO at the end of the Cold War. One is known famously as the Budapest Memorandum, in which it was argued that Ukraine, which had perhaps the 3rd largest stock of nuclear weapons, would give them up for assured security guarantees by America and the Western allies, and a surety that it won't be attacked by Russia. Both of them have fallen flat on their faces, as you have seen. The other aspect was that in 2007, Mr. Putin made it very clear that he would not be joining NATO. And I personally do not see any reason for NATO to have expansionist goals when they have some of the richest countries in the world in their fold. As you know, NATO comprises of not just European, West European countries, but also of Britain, America, and Canada. So therefore, NATO's attempted expansion, and the expansion really Putin was talking about, that NATO was originally about 12 nations in 49 when it was founded, then became 18 nations, and today it is 30. So virtually everybody who was part of the Cold War Soviet bloc has joined NATO. Now, where was Putin's worry? Putin's worry was NATO's expansion into Ukraine. Funnily enough, Mr. Brzezinski, who is the heroic president of Ukraine who's holding out even now, and interestingly, some of you might know that he was a comedian before becoming a politician. But this time he's not joking. He's serious about holding out. Now, Mr. Brzezinski has now made an announcement that we thought about NATO and we had long since given up on the idea. Strangely, Seema Sirohi, a columnist based in Washington who writes in Economic Times, said that the American press is not playing it up. Why is it not playing it up? Because she writes in another piece, which I was just reading this morning, that they want this conflict to continue forever. Because there's money to be made. And I'll explain to you how money is made in conflicts. Second thing is, they want to rub Russia's nose to the ground again. And Mr. Biden, licking his wounds after a disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, saw this as a great opportunity to return back into preeminence of showing America as the world's geostrategic giant. It has resources, it has military punch, but the way it fared in Iraq and Afghanistan left a lot of people with doubts about America's ability to influence geopolitical issues. So here was his chance. It had a game plan worked out. They were working strongly towards creating a European unity based on the Russian fear. I learned this as a student in Cambridge years ago, that international relations normally is based on 2 fundamental issues. One is that nations come together if they see the chance of economic gain. European Union, economic arrangement. There used to be something, I haven't heard of it for some time, called NAFTA. They were trying to put together SARC as an economic initiative, but it falls apart every time because Pakistan would like to bring up Kashmir there. We'll talk about it later. Then there was this recent initiative called RCEP. My show Latitude this morning on Times Now talked about it. So trade arrangements bring nations together. ASEAN holds together as a grouping, you know, that whole lot, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and even they've roped in Burma, Thailand. They're all part of ASEAN. They see a lot of trade benefits with each other. They work in barrierless trade. India is moving in that direction with the new arrangement that it has in place with UAE. It's going to go in for that with Australia, eventually with Britain, EU, etc. So trade is a great binding factor for countries that may not even share borders. The other thing that brings people together is the fear of invasion. And you're seeing how Europe has suddenly woken up to the fear of invasion. And suddenly countries that had sworn neutrality forever, Switzerland is a case in point, have decided now to take a position and take a side. And Germany, which had thought war and conflict was behind it after the end of the Second World War, has suddenly woken up and pumped in 100 billion euros, which is about 135 billion dollars, and has now decided to spend 2% of his GDP on defense, which is a lot of money when you look at Germany's economy. So countries are now going back to that 2% model, and which is what President Trump encouraged them to do and warned them about, but many of the things Trump said, people dismissed as acts of a maverick. But he was saying that, listen, you have to pay for your own security. Europe was enjoying a long holiday and growing economically exponentially because they didn't have to spend on military and military-related activity. On the contrary, Russia, its biggest selling card was its military-industrial complex. Russia, as you know, provides us, some say, more than 60% of our weapon systems, but recent studies by SIPRI, Stockholm International Institute of Peace and Research, they have said that India has up to 85% dependence on Russian equipment, which just doesn't mean the tank and the aircraft and the ships, but spare parts that go with it. So there are linkages which are very strong. One of the reasons why India has taken its position, which I support, and I think it's a good idea, but Prime Minister Narasimha Rao had once said that don't blame us for not taking a decision, because even not taking a decision is a decision. So you have to understand that this is a considered position that India has taken. And I always tell the Westerners, and we were at a dinner once at a friend's place, and two Western ambassadors were trying to, anger me with their usual rhetoric that, you should be on the side of goodness and truth. Why does the West only believe that they have a monopoly on goodness and truth? And why do they believe that their position is the God-given position for everything on earth? So I said to them, did any of you make any utterances in India's favor when India was facing the Chinese head-on? And today also this song and dance about Quad, which I think even today, I'm yet to be convinced that what is Quad's purpose? Is it a sea-based trading alliance? Or is it a grouping of countries that have decided to sell vaccines to each other based on aircraft carriers? They are not coming out clearly, because none of them have the guts to look at China in the eye and say, listen, my friend, you are my enemy number one, but you tried to mess with us and we have forces in place. Because going to the argument about nuclear weapons, and Mr. Putin has thrown that up in the air again and again, what are nuclear weapons? Professor Lawrence Friedman, who is one of the Western world's biggest gurus on nuclear war, I had the privilege of being taught by him. And in one of his major essays on nuclear conflict, the first paragraph says, nuclear weapons are about the prevention of conflict. They're not being created to be used in conflict. Because once you start the use of nuclear weapons, the cycle goes out of hand. What nuclear strategists call force, counter force, counter force, counter force. So what Western world worked out in the 80s, something called mutually assured destruction, MAD. And mutually assured destruction is something that tells you that you may launch 10 missiles at me, but I'll also launch even 5 at you. So are you willing to live with 5 cities gone? I don't have to destroy your whole country. Are you willing to live with 5 cities gone? And no country and no political leadership will be able to give you hand on heart an honest answer that yes, I'm willing to look at that loss, except somebody as demented as Mao Zedong, who once said that yes, we'll go to nuclear war, and because at the end of it there are so many Chinese that our dead will rule the rest of the world. Our Chinese will rule the rest of the world's dead, sorry, pardon me. But the argument was that we can lose all our people. And Mao Zedong, just by the bizarre experiment of the Cultural Revolution by objective accounts, Chinese lost more than 40 million people. And Mao was able to live with that with the wave of a hand, that that's the price you pay because you want to become an advanced modern country. And he crawled in front of Stalin to make sure that he gets nuclear weapons, but that's the subject of another study, which I've talked about in my book on China, which I believe is available here. Now going back to Ukraine again. So this was Putin's agenda. Now where did they go wrong? A, they thought they're going to walk in, guns and missiles all staring at the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians will put down their arms and end of story. Everything finished in 3 weeks. It hasn't finished. Two, Putin has become part of a cult. In Russia, this cult is basically led by two groups, the Orthodox Church and former members of the KGB, and which is now called FSB. And they influence Mr. Putin's thinking that all is going well on the ground. Now, dictators normally end up in this kind of a situation. I take you back to the India-Pakistan context. In 1965, when Ayub Khan launched his two-part operation to liberate Kashmir, one was called Gibraltar and one was called Grand Slam. His Gibraltar operation went completely out of control. It didn't go well for Pakistan because the Kashmiris stood up and captured a lot of Pakistanis and handed them over to the local police station. But the feedback that was coming to Ayub Khan was that it's going clockwork. It's going very well. So he launched the second part of his operation that was called Operation Grand Slam, which was a tank assault on Punjab, which again was stopped by very, very brave resistance by Indian troops. One of the better known battles is the Battle of Asal Uttar in Khemkaran, where Abdul Hamid got his Paramvir Chakra. The point is that Pakistan's entire operation went wrong because Ayub Khan as a dictator was not getting a correct feedback. The same story today. Initially I was wondering, why are Russians, how is Ukraine saying that so many Russian soldiers are being captured? I found it a bit difficult to believe. But then I looked around and I found, and I did a little research, that more than 25% of Russia's frontline units are made up of conscripts. Conscripts don't want to die. A regular soldier has signed up to go and die. सर पे कफन बांध के वो पहुंचा है लड़ाई के मैदान पर, और तुम उसको बोल रहे हो तुम मर नहीं सकते. He wants to die as against a conscript who doesn't want to die. The same thing happened with the Chinese army at Galwan. Because they were China has long had a one-child policy. So therefore, they were all one members from their family. Now, if they died defending some strange objective that Mao Zedong had spelled out and Xi Jinping is only following up on that. Mao had said, Tibet is the palm of my hand, and the 5 fingers are Ladakh, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, Arunachal. And I must get them all. So they will slowly, steadily try and get there. Whether they can achieve it or not, time will tell. I don't think it's possible. I've argued that in the last chapter of my book. But the point is, this has been China's agenda. So Ukraine was Putin's agenda. That if I get Ukraine, then I have economic control. I have control on rare earth materials. Some of you might know rare earth is very important to make lithium batteries and things like that. Ukraine has one of the largest reserves of uranium, important for nuclear related activities and not just for bombs. And it makes spare parts for a lot of military equipment, including the T-90 tanks that are with us. At one stage, Pakistan was wanting to buy that from Russia. And for the European avionics industry, the private industry of European aircraft manufacturers get a lot of parts from Russia and Ukraine. So there's that economic dimension. There's also the economic dimension that Russia was the biggest market for European car makers. So it is not that only Russia is suffering because of this whole economic standoff that followed after the conflict and the imposition of sanctions. Sanctions again, yes, some of them are effective, but the Western press, and I've always believed that the Western press is unreliable. They've been all trumpeted as, the CNN and New York Times and Washington Post and everything, but they only feed you garbage which is given to them by the bloody Pentagon and Foggy Bottom and various foreign offices. So, I think the important responsibility of the media is you say, and this is something that I learned when I went to Russia in 91, that you say they do propaganda. Of course they do, but do you do any less? You have embedded journalists who go with you to battle, whether in Iraq or Afghanistan, and they go and have a blast out there because you see some of the films about how they used to live in those areas which are totally encircled with security, and inside wine flows like rivers, and they are there and everyone gets the label of a hell of a jock because they've been on the battlefield. But what happened? You know, I remember picking up a copy of a Time magazine where a Taliban with his very stained teeth was smiling at you on the cover and said, I was here before you came, I'll be here when you go away. How true. And this is what has been proved again in this conflict, that it is not military equipment per se that defines the outcome of any conflict. It is leadership, the willingness of the frontline soldier to die to achieve that objective, and most importantly, the need to justify to your men what is your goal, what they call just war. If you don't have that spelled out, don't go to war. And aggressors normally don't have a goal that can be held up credibly for a long time. The next aspect about this conflict, and therefore Russia is floundering. It has been changing its benchmarks, it has been changing its goals to make it appear palatable to the Russian public. Interestingly, tomorrow is 9th of May when Russia celebrates May Day. What is it they're going to celebrate tomorrow? Their losses or their objectives which might one day fructify. Second, Russia is now cornered itself into a situation which the West wanted it to be in so that they do away with one other opposition to the idea of Western-led democracies. But Mr. Putin's idea is something that many Russians have now begun to know, which is called Project Russia. Project Russia was a secretive document, but it's now become public, where elements in the government have been told how Russia must stop the growth of Western democracies so that Russia and the idea of Mother Russia reigns supreme. So really, what we are seeing is another clash of civilizations, as Huntington would have called it. So clash of civilizations, ladies and gentlemen, is not just about religion. It's about geopolitical ideologies. If you don't understand that, then you're reading only halfway between the lines. And here it's about ideologies, and Ukraine has become the battlefield in the clash of civilizations between Western-led ideologies and Russian-led ideologies, both of them dating back to the 19th century. In fact, somebody wrote that Russia has taken Europe back to the 19th century, where battles were fought to define boundary lines. So what is going to be the new boundary line of Europe? One thing is, people ask India to get involved. Our argument has been, and rightly so, that this is a conflict between you guys in Europe. The map here, that's the area of the conflict, that circle, and the blue thing is Ukraine. The map here indicates that the battle is essentially about Central Europe. Now, it's another thing that the Europeans believe that they are the center of the world, so therefore the battle is being fought about the center of the world and the whole world should get involved. But how the hell can it affect South Africa? Or can it affect, Fiji Islands in Southeast Asia? Or for that matter, I don't know if you know that the bottommost tip of the world, known world, before Antarctica, is a place called Terra del Fuego, right at the bottom. उनको तो कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ता. But you say, but you must get involved, you must take a position. And there's nonsense about getting a vote in the UN. In fact, one of the American observers at the UN had said that India's stance at the UN has been characterized to be against the UN's charter. I have always believed, ladies and gentlemen, the UN is a farce. It is the world's most overpaid, overrated debating society. And we should use this opportunity to get out of the UN and say, redefine yourself and we'll come back on the high chair. We don't have to be sitting there with countries that have a population which is smaller than Villeparle. How can they have the same vote as India? We are 1/6 of humanity. And why it is the idea is kept alive, I'm sorry to say, because many of our diplomats believe that the world's future can still be decided by wearing silk ties and drinking wines and rubbing shoulders with whites. The world must reorganize itself because the UN has failed to deliver. NATO has failed to deliver. They keep talking about NATO. You know one of the reasons why NATO doesn't want to get involved? Because NATO is a toothless tiger. It is led by a political appointee who doesn't understand war. Therefore, his statements, NATO Secretary General's statements, have been out of his depth, have shown that he's out of his depth. NATO is at best a rapid reaction force which can go into Iraq or Afghanistan after America has gone in carrying NATO flags and say, we've come to give you peace. They can't inflict peace and impose peace unless they're willing to die. John Simpson of the BBC once wrote that the West likes to fight wars that are winnable. The true mark of a brave entity is to be able to fight whether you win or lose, but you'll fight like bloody hell. And if you're willing to die, your enemy can't defeat you. Ukraine has shown that. So these are important lessons that come from the conflict. There are several economic dimensions of it. The biggest, as you all know, has been about the rise in oil prices. And I'll come to the juicy part after this. But the rise in oil prices, you know, the world at one stage was reading figures like $137 a barrel and what have you. Please understand, you know, I've done a little work on oil and energy. Oil at the selling price once it's excavated is less than $30 a barrel. It is priced at 60 plus because OPEC has agreed that if it's not that, that many of the weaker OPEC nations like Ghana and Nigeria will not be at an advantage by selling oil because they're not going to make enough money to keep their economies going. Many of the oil producing countries, the only thing they have is oil. So there has been a counter to OPEC by something called an OPEC plus. The OPEC plus is led by Russia. Russia needs the prices of oil to be at least $80 upwards. So while OPEC was talking at $60 a barrel, Russia is talking $80 a barrel. Why? Because at that rate of earnings, Russia can pay back quickly the loans it has taken for modernization. So there's the other element is gas, where Russia is big player. In both areas, Russia is looking at 10 to 20% of the world's resources. So raising oil prices, and oil prices are raised not by the countries that produce them, it is by the Satta Bazaar, worldwide. So speculation is done, oh my God, this is the conflict, now suddenly the Straits of Hormuz will be blocked, so the prices of oil should be raised. So countries go into frequent buying and fervent buying so that they ensure, I've got sir, thank you. Okay, no, thank you. So they go in for fervent buying of oil so that they can stock up for a rainy day. We also keep geostrategic reserves. Some would say we have for 18 days of a crisis where there'll be no oil. Some say it is more. We are taking some 88 storage wells in Trincomalee area of Sri Lanka, which are World War II wells, and we are storing lots of oil there. But the long and short of it is 3 or 4 things. One, our budget that was announced by the finance minister was based on a premise that oil prices would be at the range of $70, $75 a barrel. Oil was running at $137 a barrel, then it came down to $120, then went to $117, then went up again. So basically fluctuation has been, so if you plan for something at $75 a barrel and you're having to buy it at almost twice the cost, obviously the money that you'll end up paying there will be taken away from other projects that the government has in mind. So that is the pinch of oil prices. The second aspect is about oil becoming a factor that Russia would use to fund its growth. So Russia would like to have the conflict continue, because the more it continues, the more the price of oil remains. But people say, if Russia is sanctioned, how can it sell oil? Sorry, Russia is selling it without any sanction controls in many European countries, Germany included, because the sanctions doesn't control oil and gas sales. Because they have worked out a timeline of maybe by end December, the European countries being able to wean themselves away from Russian oil and energy supplies. In realistic terms, they need 3 to 5 years, because Germany doesn't have any LNG ports. So the gas that it gets from Russia, it can't get alternate gas from Qatar, which is willing to give it, which, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, some years ago was declared a terrorist sponsor state by Donald Trump because he didn't buy weapons from Donald Trump. But today he's become a good guy because he's supplying gas to the Western world, their friends and allies in the white world. But the point is, Germany doesn't have those ports. So you have to have those ports to suck. Russia knows that. And Russia is smiling through that. So it has said, you buy my gas in rubles. Now this has put them in a spot, because they have to convert their currency into rubles to buy it from Russia. And which is something which goes against the stated aim of the sanctions against ruble-led trade. But it's one thing for America to make pronouncements, but another thing for them to get it implemented in countries to say, excuse me, hold it. You know, it is us who are affected. Russia has got a huge market in China. As we all know, China has unsatiable appetite on absorbing gas, energy, and all those things for its growth. So here is a chance that China is increasing its storages for the long term. And of course, India has bought a small amount. Well, that's more symbolic. And Mr. Jaishankar really shut them up by telling them some time ago, I think 2 weeks ago, that we buy as much gas in 1 month as you consume in half a day. So what are you lecturing us? So therefore, there is the gas angle and economic angle. And this is going to continue for some time because there's money to be made by a lot of agencies. The other is that financial sanctions against Russia, which initially they announced the ruble had collapsed by 30%, and that Russia's $680 billion were blocked outside. The truth is now coming out. It's about $300 billion, and Russia is now going to get it back by squeezing them to say that if you don't give us our money back, then you guys go without gas supplies in Europe. What are you going to do to me? You're going to attack me? I'll hit you back. And that's what second strike is all about. So it's not as good as it's being made out to be. Western press will tell you that President Biden has got everything right. Partially yes, but partially no. Because the thing that Biden and his lackeys are really benefiting from is from arms sales. Wars, ladies and gentlemen, are about the arms bazaar. Now, let me give you some statistics. The first Gulf War, 1990-91, when Iraq was attacked, initial projections were $70 billion would be the cost of the war. But later the figures went to over $100 billion, of which more than 85% was paid for by Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Because Americans told them, we are defending you, you pay for your defense. And they happily paid, because even that was the cost of the summer holiday of the royals of the Saudis. But that money is now gone up dramatically. So 2 Harvard professors, one of them being Joseph Stiglitz, who's a Nobel Prize winner, I've written a book called The $3 Trillion War. So Gulf War II was projected to be, at modest estimates, worth $3 trillion. We're not just talking of arms sales. We're talking of buildings destroyed, they have to be built again. You know, NGOs flourish in these kind of situations. Give them a crisis, they'll get more Pajeros. And so those kind of things get more and more money in. And therefore, the cost of the entire conflict becomes much more than what you see on the ground. Thus, President Biden has already put into the pipeline at least $15 billion worth of American funding for weapon systems for Ukraine. Now, whether those weapon systems are offensive or defensive, NATO is as usual, hedging around and not giving clarity. Offensive classically is fighter aircrafts. Defensive is anti-tank weapons which stop tanks from coming to you. But a lot of things flow in between. Russia says either way that you bring more of them into play, I will keep hitting them and destroying them. Because Russia is now, and something I said on television in the first week of the conflict, that when the conflict started, they said, where do you see it going? I said, A, you're going to see Ukraine divided into two parts like East and West Germany after the Second World War. Second, the division is already provided by nature. There is a river that runs through Ukraine called the Dnieper River, D-N-I-E-P-E-R. And that cuts Ukraine into 1/3 in the east and 2/3 in the west. And that is all Russia would be happy to have, I mean, based on the resistance the Ukrainians have put up. At least for now, the Donbas region is part of that eastern bloc. More of that Russia will try and acquire eventually. But the problem with the Russians is that they feel anybody who opposes the idea of Mother Russia taking them over, and Ukrainians, many of them speak languages similar to Russians. So those are people who were part of them, but they've now tasted the free world and the pleasures of being part of a European system, and they want to be part of the European system. Whereas on the bloc, which is on the eastern side of the river, many people spoke Russian. Their salaries came from Moscow in the Donbas region, municipal commissioners, school teachers, everything. And their allegiance was still with Russia. Whereas in the western side, money, arms, everything is being pumped in for them. So it's a kind of a model that's become, on one side, trying to prove that my system is better than yours, and therefore I want people who subscribe to my system to be more affluent, flourishing, etc. The other aspect about this conflict is, this has now defined what people call the new Cold War. The new Cold War is going to be between America on one side and China and Russia on the other. China, as you know, has made it known that it is a forever kind of a partnership now they have with Russia. China, however, doesn't want Russia to have a sweeping victory, because that will make Putin equal to Xi Jinping. It wants Russia to have half win, half loss. So it's there, but not there. What does China need Russia for? For nuclear technology, for military technology, because Russia is more advanced than China on that. What does Russia need China for? It needs a market for its oil. Russian oil was also, and gas was also very popular in Japan and Korea, but they're now part of the Western Alliance, and they've always been. But, so therefore China and Russia are likely to get together. Their strategic agenda, as per The Economist, was that all parts of the world east of what was, which is this river, I think it is the Amu Darya or something that runs through Russia, that river Volga and all that comes east of that block, Siberia, that becomes area of Chinese influence, Japan, Korea, etc., in geopolitical terms. And Russian part, Russia dominates Europe. That is the geostrategic agenda, leaving America to handle other parts of the world wherever American influence runs and aircraft carriers go. So therefore, that was the geostrategic agenda that Russia and China were working towards. It is a lie to say that China was not informed by Putin about his aims to take over Ukraine. Because Putin had made his intentions clear in 2014. He'd taken over that island that comes out of Ukraine, many of you would have seen in the map, called Crimea. Crimea is between the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. And Crimea was actually gifted by Russia to Ukraine well before Ukraine broke away and became a modern state after the Cold War. It was gifted by Russia to Ukraine, I think, around 1914. And therefore, Russia went and took it back. The world saw signs of it. And Russia was playing also a revenge game against how these guys had taken over Kosovo, parts of Yugoslavia, which was in southern Europe. And that time, the West bombed the hell out of Kosovo for 78 days, while Russia and Mr. Lavrov, who's now the foreign minister, was then Russia's permanent representative at the UN, was pleading that, listen, give UN a chance to find a way out. They said, no, we've got the certificate of what they call the coalition of the willing, and we are going in with that. So Russia is also, I would say that Russia is probably looking at a 78-day mark to kind of find a way out. What is going to come out of it? Will the conflict end? If there is a solution in a conflict, it will only come when both sides who are involved in the conflict see there is something to gain from a solution, not from war. Right now, everyone except the people on the streets are gaining from a conflict. Secondly, Russia needs an exit strategy. But that exit strategy will have to be such that it shows them in good light, and therefore the changing goals for the conflict by Russia. Third, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has now announced that there's going to be a Joint Expeditionary Force, JEF, which is a bit of a secretive organization until now, but it's going to be part of 10 NATO countries. And the first time since World War II, the leaders of these 10 NATO countries met at Chequers, the house of the British Prime Minister, which is the weekend home in UK. And over dinner and the fireside, they sat and worked out what should be their strategy in case Russia encroaches the rest of Europe. Will they fight? Won't they fight? The other aspect is that India's absence from voting panels has upset the West. But India, as we know, and we are convinced, has done the sensible and right thing. India's relationship with Russia goes beyond defense. We have space partnerships with Russia. You know, as you know, Wing Commander Rakesh Sharma was put into space by the Russian help. Even now, our space missions are working with Russia. We also have energy partnerships with Russia, and Prime Minister has worked out a pipeline which is going to be running, which is going to be a shipping pipeline from Vladivostok to here. Vladivostok is on the right edge of Russia, at the Siberian edge, and from there it will come to India. Another North Sea oil tanker service has come to India from the European side, because the Russians have now run into a huge amount of oil in the Arctic Circle. So that's going to completely alter the oil geopolitics in the next 5 to 10 years, where they will become the Saudi Arabia of oil. And you can't take that away from Russia. So India has that relationship with Russia. India also is benefiting to some extent when the conflict is going on, because our exporters are getting access to markets which were used to Ukrainian Russian products, whether it's food grains, whether it's some of the edible oils, because much of that is not really moving out, because Turkey has blocked the Dardanelles Strait that connects Istanbul to Europe and at the end of the Black Sea, from where Russian shipping can go out. So no shipping can really go out or go in from the Mediterranean. So therefore, those export lines are stopping the export of products from there, which India is benefiting from. And also, India is now looking at new military partnerships. One of them is the Prime Minister's recent visit to France, which has long-standing relationships with India. the biggest supporter of India, the first country to support India's position for getting a seat in the UN Security Council, has provided us the Rafale jets, has recently provided us the P-75 kilo-class submarines. It's opted out of the P-75I project, which is a more advanced version. So those are opportunities that European countries are going to look for India. Everybody who is used to Russia providing them certain markets and access pre-Ukraine conflict are now flocking to India. EU president was in India, so there's going to be natural gas, there's going to be also alternate energies such as projects to work towards harnessing solar energy with India. Prime Minister was there in the Nordic countries looking at that project. Germany, the economic giant of Europe, is now wanting to have greater partnerships with India. So India is in a win-win situation. To hell with what the West thinks about us. It really doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, you have to tell the West, are you going to come and pay my bills? You aren't. So keep quiet. Now, the other aspect that India has really to play upon, and I'm not going to touch much on Quad because I think it's a waste of time. Quite frankly, everyone seems to be jumping around about Quad without knowing what Quad's objectives are. Simply put, Quad should have a military objective to contain China. You can't do that, you can't do anything else. It's like how the Pakistanis say, that you solve all the problems with us, but you don't solve the Kashmir issue, we still have a problem. And you solve the Kashmir issue and don't worry about the rest, all our problems will be solved. Same thing with Quad. You give it a military objective and make it known to China that we're going to clip your wings in the high seas, and you're looking at a new geostrategic equation. India is the only country in Quad that has a border problem with China, which is facing eye to eye with Chinese troops on the Himalayas. The rest of them Angrezi bol rahe. They are not really facing the threat of China. They're only sitting in seminar rooms and speculating. Now, the last point, 2-3 points that I wish to make, and I'm going to be done with. First is regarding foreign exchange reserves. How much do we need to prepare for contingencies? Some of you might be intrigued to know that the Reserve Bank of India in its wisdom has said that it can sustain India's economic growth pattern, whichever is laid out by the IMF and the Foreign Finance Ministry and others, even if oil prices are $150 a barrel for 2 months. It's not reached there, और लोगों की अभी से बत्ती बंद है, but the fact of the matter is that even if it goes to $150 a barrel, the government of India and the Reserve Bank can sustain our economic growth agenda for 2 months or more, and it's not going to get there. If it gets there, a lot of people have suicide in the stock markets anyway. The second thing is that India tea exports to Russia will be impacted. So you have to find for new markets for tea export. And we are one of the world's largest exporters of tea. 13% of our exports go to Russia for tea. How long can that happen or not happen? We'll have to see. There is an argument that India needs to see what it's going to do in the world after the conflict. The interesting subscript that is coming out in all the statements that is being made by important world leaders is we understand now India's position. Except one buffoon that is there in Mr. Biden's administration called Dilip Singh. Now, you know, sometimes people are more loyal to the king than the crown itself, than themselves. I said the wrong thing, more loyal to the crown than the king himself. So Dilip Singh came here and tried to read out the Riot Act to say that, you know, what happens when China encroaches your territory, attacks you, who will stand with you? My counter to him was, were you with us when China attacked us? America's reputation to stand by its allies is highly contestable. Let me give you a couple of examples. There are 2 islands off the coast of Japan and China called Senkaku Deyayu. Japan has been a long-standing ally of America, but I mean, these are just bloody rocks in the Pacific. But China lays claim, Japan lays claims. But when China encroached there, America made an assertion that if China is not the first to start the conflict, we'll come. If Japan is not the first to start the conflict, America will come in aid of Japan. Are you going to wait in today's conflicts which have supersonic weapons involved, the first mover has many advantages. The job is to deter the first mover from taking the first move. And that is what nuclear weapons do. They are हाथी के दांत दिखाने के खाने के नहीं है, लेकिन इतने होने चाहिए दिखाने के कि दूसरा डर जाए उससे. The second aspect that where America's claims have not been delivered adequately is all this announcement about their fight against terror. I have said so from day one after 26/11. It was not a global war on terror, or after 9/11, sorry. It is not a global war on terror, it was America's war on terror. Driven by the American arms industry, America loves a good war. They can sell more weapons. They can revive their industries. What happened in Afghanistan? They went to fight a global war on terror. They pulled back with their tails between their legs, with leaving behind weapon systems worth $80 billion. I mean, this is a shame. That's $80 billion, just to put it in context, ladies and gentlemen, is India's, broadly, it's India's defense outlay for the year. He just threw it away and walked away. So they buy weapons which have a certain timeline, and they throw it up and walk away, because in their inventory, this needed to have been replaced anyway after 5 years. Whereas we buy weapons platform that have to have a minimum sustainability of 30 years, maybe 40, 45 years. So some of our fighter jets, like MiG-21s and others, are more than 50 years old. Would you drive a car in Mumbai 50 years old? You won't. But you expect your Air Force to go to war with 50-year-old aircrafts, right? And they still, poor chaps, go ahead, and they still go and deliver. So you can imagine the level of training and determination, and you can imagine the skills of the pilot who do that. Remember, Abhinandan, Wing Commander Abhinandan shot down that damn F-16 with a MiG-21, which was 60 years old, right? America's defense industry paid White House, don't admit that went down. They said, we've even done a check of Pakistan's inventory, and we found all the F-16s are there. So then it must have shot down the J-17 of the Chinese, because those are the two that were after Abhinandan. And J-17 of Chinese is the equivalent of their Rafale. So ya to wo gira ya ye gira. Now you decide what fell, but he dropped one down and the second down, and Pakistanis are such shameless characters that the other poor pilot of theirs who was one got parachuted out, which was shot out, and the poor chap was clobbered to death by villagers thinking he's an Indian pilot. He is son of an air marshal. Poor chap was given an award in silence and said, ki chup raho, bol mat kuch. Because they don't want to admit anything can go wrong with them, just like the Balakot strikes, which took them completely by surprise. But we have evidence, and Masood Azhar's brother admitted on radio to say, ki haan sahab, hamla to hua hai. What more do you want? But anyway, long and short of it is, I have now, sorry, but I've spoken a little more. I've spoken for about an hour, but I think I've covered most of the thing. The only thing is, China is the biggest gainer in this conflict, and American arms industry the next bigger. For India, it's a wake-up call that we need to look at the role of the UN, India's arrangements with the world order, and how these lessons of this conflict can be learnt in dealing with future challenges. Can you just rely on heavy weapons and technologies to turn the course of battle? The Ukrainians have shown that the last few hundred yards of battle have still to be fought on foot. No tanks, no aircrafts, no fancy helicopter systems. You have to get down on the ground and plant your bloody flag there. Nahi to वो आपकी ज़मीन नहीं होती है. And that is where the Russian troops are having a problem, because they hadn't prepared themselves to fight to the finish, and you can't defeat a country whose people are willing to die. So that's the lesson that I take away from the conflict, but we can now go for the question answer.
So like I said in the beginning, you'll see our volunteers in the aisles. Please pass on your questions. But like always, some of you have been very nice and have given us questions to start with. So Maroof ji, I'll try and put together some of the themes so that, we can sort of club the questions and then take one theme at a time. So I think the first one, and I think people still are looking for you to give us some peek view or sneak peek view into the future. So, I mean, militarily, is there anything you think Russia could do or should do to change the course of the war? And second, you did mention about, something on the JEF or something, but do you really think that NATO will get involved at some point of time in an actual war?
That's a very good question. The thing is that as far as NATO is concerned, as I said to you, it's a toothless tiger. So they need to do a serious overhaul to be able to take on conflict of this. Militaries all over the world do something called wargaming. So they plan every operational scenario in great detail. And they are normally fixed onto those modules that the enemy will attack from here, we will hold him in this direction and we'll bypass him and take over his key reserve areas, which will put his forces in a bit of a spot, what to do next. Now, that's the normal conventional scenario. And I don't think NATO had, in the last 30 years or more, after the end of the Cold War, planned on a Soviet invasion of a European country. So it's not going to be easy for NATO to be able to do very much right now, because when these plans are discussed, then troops have to implement them in the form of military exercises. So you do wargaming on the ground. You remember Operation Brass Tacks? It was done at 4 levels. Brass Tacks 1 was when General Sundarji had conceived the idea. 2 was when there were sand model discussions like you see in old World War II films. People have these big models on the ground and they move tank units here and infantry and helicopter comes in and they said this will be the resistance that will be met, because this is all based on statistics. For example, anti-tank helicopter systems like Apache have something called a standoff distance. A standoff distance is about 3,700 meters to 4,000 meters. So a tank can only fire at that up to a range of 2.5. So it can stand away from the tank and hit the tanks. So these kind of models are played out, that what will I launch, what will he launch, where do we go and what are gains, and there are umpires who give that this much losses, so this is what you can hope to get. Then the troops on ground have to implement that thing by doing a similar exercise. So that was Brass Tacks 3. And Brass Tacks 4 was when you get back and do an analysis that where did you go. Line is not available with NATO right now to plan that. As far as what Russia can do, I think Russia would be smart enough to go. You see the conflict in Sri Lanka, I know I'm suggesting something which is other than what the peacemakers would love to hear, that go and sign on the dotted line, but if he does that, it might be the end of Putin's era of presidency. So he cannot be signing on a dotted line and writing his own death sentence. So he will go for a situation which will allow him to go back to the Russian people that I've achieved my objectives. How does he achieve this objective? It's not that he hasn't killed any civilian as yet, so he'll be shy of killing civilians. Whatever the figures of civilians dead, I mean, Russia should now announce, just like Russia announced at the beginning of the conflict, that don't come into my turf, otherwise I could use nuclear weapons. So Russia can announce that I am now going to go hammer and tongs. You want to protect your civilians, I'm giving you the last 24 hours or 48 hours for corridors to exit. If you don't exit from there, count yourself as dead. Sri Lanka did this in the conflict against the Tamil Tigers. For 30 years, they were in this tuch-put kind of conflict with the Tamils, bomb attack here, a little attack there, and all that stuff. But eventually, the Sri Lankan army was given the go-ahead that just clear the bloody area off. So they went hammer and tongs, and they rewrote the rules of fighting and insurgency. that you don't keep it at a war of attrition which is constantly firing at each other at a low level of conflict. Just scale it up and finish off all the opposition and then count the dead after that. Now, I'm sorry I sound so blunt, but if Russia has to win, that is an option they would possibly exercise. Otherwise, it's a game of wearing each other out, that let it prolong, and whichever side gets exhausted will give up. But Ukraine, I don't see it getting exhausted, because now they have tasted success of holding the Russians off, and they are getting endless money and supplies from the US and West. So therefore, they are quite happy to be in this game forever.
So I know we've sort of got some hang of your views on all these acronym-based alliances and what they mean. But post, whenever the war comes to a much lower decibel level, do you see some changes in some of these alignments? Do you see a NATO losing its relevance because they didn't help out somebody? Do you see a UN not really having anything more to do with? So where do you think all of these things are going to go? And you have your opinion on Quad, but where do you think some anti-China alliances will go? So what do you think will really happen in terms of global alliances and the role maybe of Russia itself?
Well, let me start with Russia. Russia is going to go deeper into an embrace with China. That's a given. Two, Russia and China are going to be what earlier, I mean, it suits us in a way, in the case of India, as long as Russia continues to engage with us. Because we had for long talked about a multipolar world. Now, you know, after collapse of the Cold War, collapse of the Berlin Wall, the world became a unipolar world, which was led by the US. China, as we know, wasn't that strong 30 years ago. Then it became a bipolar world, which was China and America, really the big rivals. The rest of us, tamasha from the sides. Russia was quiet, but Russia still felt that you can't see us as a pushover because militarily we are huge and strong. It might interest some of you to know that Russia has the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world. It has something like 5,997 warheads. So America, with its European allies, Britain and France, has close to the Russian stockpile. So China and all dure, they have 450 warheads. India has just about 150, Pakistan has more than us, but that's no cause for worry. Because the fact is that if they're going to use it against us, as General Padmanabhan, a former army chief, had said, that we will respond in a way that Pakistan will cease to exist as a viable state. So therefore, we don't have to worry about that. Nuclear weapons are based on the concept of minimum deterrence, not maximum deterrence. So minimum assured deterrence is your ability to inflict reasonable damage to the enemy. So if China were to think of attacking us, they have to ask themselves a question: will they be willing to lose 50 cities to 50 bombs from India, right? And Pakistan another 30, 40, and another 50, 60 for second strike. So basically, Russia has massive military punch. Russia is a big player in space, satellite, and modern missile technology. So it's not going to go away anywhere. So it will be America against China, Russia combined. The American establishment wants Russia to be so weak that it can never threaten Europe again. I think that's a pipe dream. America makes these large announcements, but can never see any of that fulfilled. They went in for these so-called John Mearsheimer, an American political scientist of eminence, had said in a statement that America is really behind the start of this conflict because it went in for expansionist agendas. NATO was fed on the model of expansionism. It went in for an agenda to make the Ukrainians believe that America will come in and support them. And America wanted Russia to be limited to the territories of Russia and not go back to the erstwhile Soviet Union. And therefore Russia responded the way it did. What will Europe do? Europe will become more militarized. That's a given. Every country in Europe has now more or less decided that they are going to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. That's a lot of money if you count all of European GDP put together. Then there will be more tussle for energy sources, because Europe has seen its vulnerability to not having natural gas, dependence on Russia. But where will they create new energy sources? Will they eat into Middle East sources? If they eat into Middle East sources, where do buyers like India and China go? Nobody should then blame us for taking more and more oil from Russia, because Europe will not take it from them, and Russia needs a market for its oil. And it would probably send it to us for non-OPEC prices. So OPEC prices are based on Western nudging to the OPEC market that keep it at that price, which is good enough, which is $60, $65 a barrel. But Russia might sell it to us at $35 a barrel. Why not buy it in bulk and store like hell? So there is going to be the oil geopolitics that is going to play out. There is also going to be, what is going to be India's role? That's a big question mark all over the world and in South Bloc. I think India, I have always argued that India would do best to be a swing state. Now, what is a swing state? Have you seen a pendulum swing? So we will take a call on every situation based on our national interest. So sometimes when we have to make noises that suit Washington, we'll do that, like Quad. Sometimes we have to make noises which suit Moscow, we'll do that to say you cannot question a country's geostrategic or national agenda. Sometimes we have to keep quiet about it when people ask us to cast a vote at the UN or not. So that is a swing state. Okay. And I think we can do it. If Switzerland has got away by being a neutral state for so long, just see the benefits of becoming a neutral state. You might have the new UN headquarters in Delhi. Because everyone will be happy to engage with. So our diplomats, who I'm sorry to say, who have got so used to a world order that they are used to engaging with, don't see beyond the writing on the wall. You pitch in. You know, years ago, Britain wanted to have the headquarters of the Commonwealth countries here in India. That would make Commonwealth look like a nuclear body and not a hangout of coat-tail hangers of the British Empire. But the great Dr. Manmohan Singh, in his wisdom, decided not to attend the Chogam Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Sri Lanka because it would upset our South Indian politicians. And India lost the chance to lead a group of countries, 54 countries. They were begging to India, come and be our leader. Itna to politics mein bhi nahi hota. That they don't beg to you to become a leader, you have to go and get their vote. But they were begging. So we are masters at losing historical opportunities. And then we say the train passed us by. So that is what I see the options coming out.
Sir, I mean, in general, I know you've given some idea, but how do you see what India has done thus far? There's been a lot of talk about how apparently we did well with the evacuation of students, etc. But leave aside that and your views on that as well. But in general, in this conflict, your views on where we are, could we have done more, less?
Okay. Now, I think the evacuation of Indian students was remarkable. I think the government needs all the credit, and any criticism of that is nonsense. I mean, whenever you do anything, you have to look at the plus-minus factors of that. If 75% or two-thirds of the opinion is in your favor, you've done very, very well. So we've evacuated who we could. How many other countries evacuated their students? Our nearby neighbors like Pakistan and others, they would have bloody hitched a ride on our plane, for all you know. Because they did it in Yemen when General V.K. Singh went to get Indians out of Yemen. We evacuated people from 26 countries, including Pakistan. So we have a record, and we are a country, our constitution now, and historically, we respect human lives. And therefore, our respect for human lives and our humanitarian approach to civilizational ethos is greater driving factor than only current day geopolitics. The second thing is, could we have done more? Under the circumstances, we were willing to do more if we were allowed to. We had used some of our long-range Air Force aircrafts also to fly in humanitarian aid and assistance. I had suggested this at the earliest stages of the TB debate, that India's embassy should engage more with the Russians where we are and get our students to exit towards Russia also. Why should everyone head to Poland? Because Poland is Western-centric now, but you are caught up in Mariupol or Odessa or wherever, if you know the map of Ukraine, which is close to Russia, then get to Russia. And Russia, to Mera Naam Joker is still remembered there. So they will be willing to help us. So you could do that. Could we do more later? I don't know, I don't think so, because there will be a lot of American and Western agencies wanting to do humanitarian construction work, etc., etc. वो उनको खेल खेलने दो, हमको उससे क्या लेना देना. So I think broadly we've done the right thing. Broadly we have made all the right noises about how the conflict, yes, India has been repeating again and again that let peace find a way out of the conflict, but that's घिसा हुआ. Everyone says that. Beyond that, we can't really say more. I think off the record, we would have said things to our interlocutors to say that, you know, we need you also to climb down. You see, no peace arrangement, no end to conflict can come because of both sides stating their full-fledged objective, which is all win for them and all losses for other. That's the problem we have with even China and Pakistan. You know, the fact is that Pakistanis say, give us all of Kashmir, and off the record, the Vesper ki LOC pe baith jao yaar, wahin pe theek hai. So we are not willing to also express that we are ready to settle for LOC as a border, and there are many champions in this country, and including military officers, and I tell them, give me a militarily logical reason. How can you gain all of POK with a fight? Last 70 years, you think you were part of the same army, you think you guys were so incompetent, you couldn't have gained it then, now you are saying you will go and gain it. So let's be realistic with the objectives, what you can get. There is one thing which is a perception. There is another thing which is what you can do on the ground. So I think we should be willing to offer. We have been first responder to natural crisis, various parts of the world, including the tsunami. And we can be. We have the world's largest peacekeeping force in operation at any given time with the UN. And we have a tremendous record for peacekeeping. We could be peacekeepers in Ukraine thereafter, though many soldiers will be selected think that they're going to go to Europe for peacekeeping, but that's not going to be the Europe that they are going to see. But we could be peacekeepers. We have a tremendous record for peacekeeping. Many of our generals, General Thimaya, General Premchand, General Satish Nambiar, General Bikram Singh, various others have been peacekeeping force commanders in service and after retirement. And therefore, that is an area we can make massive contributions in. And peacekeeping is not just about ensuring people don't shoot at each other. It's ensuring development takes place. It's ensuring that other initiatives are put into place for people to roll back into life, medical facilities, etc., etc. So that's an area, and some people have suggested India could play the role of a mediator. I don't know whether the government will accept that or not, because India has traditionally been allergic to be a mediator. Tomorrow they'll say, we want to be mediator on Kashmir issue. Will you be willing to accept that? So there is the troubled area.
So sir, changing tack, and I know we've got your book, and I am hoping many of us will take a lot of benefit out of reading that.
Ji.
But a few questions which, because it's that big neighbor sitting next to us. Post this war, and I know you said China is one of the biggest beneficiaries, but what do you think will happen on the first one which everybody is talking about, the China-Taiwan conflict, what will happen in Formosa and all those places?
You see, earlier, in the first couple of weeks of the conflict, people said that, you know, China is now going to be emboldened and do the same in Taiwan. I don't think it's going to do that now that easily. Because if Xi Jinping goes in for an operation in Taiwan and meets the same fate as Putin's forces in Russia, Xi Jinping is not going to be able to sustain his position as a lifelong leader of Chinese. You know, he's got the constitution to be restructured in such a way that he'll be the first person this year, I think in September, who will get a third term, unprecedented third term as president and leader. So, you know, people go in, the Chinese are more sensible than the Russians. They work to a plan. Nothing happens in China without a plan. Mr. Gokhale has written a very good book, The Long Game. Yeah. And in that, he has talked about how the Chinese are like an octopus. A big head on top, which is Beijing in the leadership, and the arms, that is the army, navy, intelligence agencies, the financial agencies, everybody else that work on directions of the big head on top. Nothing works out of context. They're not a democracy like us that everyone has an opinion, right? The second thing about China is that now, I mean, the Taiwanese are not a pushover. If Ukraine is not a pushover, Taiwan's even tougher. Because Taiwan, please remember, is one of the biggest economies, at least in Asia, East Asia, if not the world. I mean, a small country, but that has a trade with China over $300 billion. Now, are they going to be willing to sacrifice $300 billion of a foolish claim made by Mao Zedong? That we must acquire Taiwan because it is a broken territory of our territory. ठीक है यार. Historically, the Chinese also claim the South China Sea. Why? Because in 223 BC, some Chinese ships sailed there. Okay? By that account, we should claim at least all of Asia, if not the world, because our people also went all over. But can you really implement it in today's world? And how much does territorial acquisition really help you? If China wants to be the world's most preeminent country, that's their agenda for 2050, when Chinese Communist Party completes 100 years in 2049. The Chinese modern state, Communist Party is 1919 ka. So that was why they did in 2020 what they did, that they first spread the pandemic and got the world into panic. And I've written an article about it on 3rd April 2020 in the Open magazine, that it came from a Chinese lab. So once in a while, I'm quite suspicious that even right now, the Chinese who are dying, they're again an experimental effort by China to tell the world that, see, we are also victims of the pandemic. So don't say that we are spreading it, hamare bhi mar rahe hain. But they're willing to lose a few thousand people. It doesn't really make a difference if the national agenda is served. Okay, have to understand how the Chinese think. The second thing is that they want to be the most important militarily and economic power. Now, they already have the largest navy in the world. Not that they can match the Americans for punch, because China is still getting its act together with one aircraft carrier. Aircraft carrier doesn't work on its own. It works like a monarch on the sea with about 40, 50 ships and submarines underneath. So it's a full kind of naval armada which moves. And we have right now 2 aircraft carrier groups. And we're the only ones in Asia, Asian country that has it. China is getting to grips with that. But America has 11 aircraft carrier groups. I mean, the force levels they can bring to bear in battle are enormous. So, you know, there's a lesson also from Ukraine for America, India, China, everybody, that very well armed and heavily armed militaries are good for discussions as force multipliers. But on the ground, you need different kind of soldiers, the blood and guts soldiering of boot and bayonets, which infantrymen of my stock are trained to do. Ki, at the end of the day, you'll have to go and plant the damn flag there. So don't expect artillery shells to carry the flag and put it on a hilltop. You'll bloody well go there. So that's what they teach you in the military. So China itself cannot, I don't see it attacking Taiwan, losing out on a trade of $300+ billion, getting into a situation which would become a messy situation like Ukraine. You know, Chinese like everything clinical. It has to be clean. It happens tuck, 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 by the book, and next day it's all wiped out and the red flag is hoisted there, and China did it. It didn't happen in Galwan. That's what gave them a real shaking. It's there in the last chapter in my book. And Chinese are countries, China has borders with 14 countries, right? But it has problems with more than 14 countries. Seriously. I mean, it has problems with a lot of Southeast Asian countries like Philippines and all that. Vietnam, it may not have border. Vietnam, they have a border, but not with Philippines. So China has to play multiple cards. And I don't think China will, in a hurry, undo their geostrategic agenda to to become America's rival or even more superior to America by getting involved in a messy battle over Taiwan.
But so more specifically for India, anything in which you see
See,
changing?
China has suddenly realized, and some things, were not publicized earlier because of our internal politics, Mrs. Gandhi's time. Chinese troops tried to browbeat us at a place called Nathula in 1967. There is a book called Nathula Watershed 1967 by Prabal Dasgupta, who reviewed my book on China in the Indian Express a month or so ago. He's also, like me, a former army officer, then went to study abroad, but he is a banker here in Mumbai. He gave a damn good review to my book, but the fact is that his book talks about the Nathula campaign. My book also has a chapter on Nathula. Now, the Chinese were thinking, and they were loudspeakers. Chinese are very good at Hindi, incidentally. So when we go for India-China meetings and exercises, our chaps are cursing, abusing everything in Hindi, and they're making notes of everything. And they're keeping absolutely poker-faced. You seen a photograph of a Chinese soldier? So completely poker-faced. He's not giving away anything. He's just absorbing everything. He's on listening watch. So they were shouting out through the microphone, anti-India thing. Don't forget, 62 ko bhulna mat, wohi karenge, ye karenge. There was an Indian military commander there called General Sagat Singh. Now, Sagat Singh was probably one of the best field commanders we've had since independence. He led the parachute brigade in the occupation of Goa. Then in 67, he was a GOC, a Major General commanding 17 Div around Gangtok. And he told his unit commanders that, listen, you carry on with building a fence on the boundary because the Chinese keep coming on this side of the boundary and say, yeah, hamara hai. So to stop any further incursions, just build a fence. Chinese didn't want them to build a fence. So there were scuffles and argument, and suddenly one fine day, the Chinese opened up with machine gun fire on our people who were building fences. And there were telephone lines that were laid out. In the army, you have handheld telephones which you go down like this. And it has a wire that goes to the next post and next post, next post. And the reports came to Sagat Singh. His brigade commander was a gentleman called Brigadier MMS Bakshi, who had got the Mavi Chakra in 65. Sagat Singh said, just go for it, hammer and tongs. And he cut off his telephone lines with higher headquarters. He said, I'm not going to answer any bloody phone call. And he, in one day's firing, killed something like 350 Chinese, right? Chinese later admitted to 65 dead, but that means multiply by 4. Okay. So that's the standard pattern with them. So they shut up for 20 years after that, right? Second time, but Mrs. Gandhi and her government didn't announce it because एक तो हमारे खास diplomats जो South Block में बैठते हैं, they were not consulted, just like they were not consulted in Galwan. So therefore, the foreign ministry even now is trying to find a place for itself in trying to go back to the model of engaging with China so that you remain permanently engaged but get no solution. That's the general model they follow. I asked them, 22 rounds of special representative talks, where have you moved? कि आप वहीं कदम ताल कर रहे हैं, right? So there is a problem there. Then in 1987, the Chinese again intruded in a place near Walong, and there is a river that flows there called Namkachu. And around that, they intruded. General Sundarji immediately asked his corps commander there, 33 Corps Commander General Narhari. Narhari was a tough soul, loved a good round of basketball in the evening, and after that a few drinks, but he thought with clarity even with his dinks. And he told him, he says, Nar, just go for it. Overnight, they lifted whatever troops they could from the Arunachal area by helicopter and surrounded the Chinese who had intruded. Suddenly, Rajiv Gandhi came in the know of it as hushed whispers were being exchanged in the Navy Day function on 4th of December. Every service has Army Day, 15 January, Navy Day, 4th December, because that was the day Navy attacked Karachi and blew up Karachi in 71. So Rajiv was completely flustered. He says, let's meet in the ops room after this. So just quickly after the cup of tea, everyone rushed to the ops room, for a briefing. And I know it for a fact because General Sundarji in one long evening's conversation in Washington gave me the story, but his ADC confirmed that, and it's there on the internet. Type Sundarji Somdrongchu, you'll get the story. Rajiv Gandhi said, General, what have you done? He said, Prime Minister, I've done what was my job, to defend India's territory. And he says, but you've surrounded the Chinese. He says, precisely, because they entered Indian territory. So he says, what are we to do now? He says, Prime Minister, you should do now what is your job. And he says, what is that? He says, implement a policy against China. I give a direction. So the Prime Minister looked around the room, and this is, I stand by these statements because this is said to me by General Sundarji, and I will omit the unpleasantries, but just that. So the Prime Minister looked around and he says, what is our China policy? So pop came a voice, rather accented. He says, Madame's policy was not to upset the Chinese. So Rajiv looked at that person and mimicked him and said, now where did Madame get that policy from? So the voice came, Panditji. Right? So Rajiv looked around and said, well, so that will be our policy, that we will not upset the Chinese. So General said, sir, I have done what was mandated to me by the Cabinet Committee on Security's decision. Now, I will not pull back the troops because I will look like a fool. So please find somebody else to lead your army. Luckily and I think, having known General Sundarji a bit personally, I owe it to his memory to set this record straight. Luckily, the Chinese pulled back the next day. So it was face saving for everybody. But between 87 and now, they didn't intrude. So you show China a firm hand, they will not intrude. There are many other options. There's something known as the revolving door strategy for the Himalayas, which means if they come in Aksai Chin, you go in from Arunachal and say, we've got in, now you pull back, we pull back. And we raised a strike corps in that area to do precisely that. The second thing is, if you read my book, you'll find out that if push comes to shove, don't be misled by statistics that journalists tell us, China has so many tanks, China has, are yaar, zameen pe kya la sakte hain? Are they going to have tank battles on the Himalayas at 20,000 feet? You don't know how tanks function. Tanks need open space. They can't go up mountains all the time. Thoda bahut kar sakte. You remove the radiator of the tank, which is a very heavy thing. So if you remove the radiator, the tank gets lighter and it can go up a hillock, like we did in the Kailash ranges. It's another matter that our great negotiators gave away the Kailash ranges to the Chinese. Chinese couldn't believe that they saw Indian troops sitting on Kailash ranges just above the Moldo base from where they were negotiating. Had we stayed on there, we would have had a permanent edge over them. The only time in our history where we have gone out and occupied a territory which gives us strategic advantages and held on to that. And hats off to some of our chiefs who stood up and told the politicians that, sir, if you ask me to withdraw, give me an order in writing and I will not be held back responsible to take it again because I can't take it again. And that is at Siachen Glacier, the world's highest icy battlefield. We are holding on to it, and that is important because on one side is the Karakoram ranges, Aksai Chin, where the Chinese are advancing, and they are holding on to a place called Depsang Plains. In between lies the Siachen Glacier, and this side is POK, where Pakistan has given the Shaksgam Valley in 1963, that has 242 glaciers and making it the world's largest glaciated systems, which when melted, and Chinese can melt anything, as you know. So when melted, can provide a huge amount of water resources, which China needs, and which my book also covers. What is their aim in Aksai Chin and POK, and their aim is to control as much of rivers and water resources so that that water can not just produce electricity, but static fresh water added with the sands of the desert, which is north of POK called Taklamakan Desert, and you can make silicon semiconductors with it. Okay. So 10,000 liters of fresh water and a huge dam, which is say 25 to 30 kilometers long and I don't know how much broad, can store in many, many 10,000 liters of water. And every 10,000 liters of water is suitably used with technology and desert sand, can give you 30 centimeters square of silicon wafer. And a little part of that is in a chip that goes into this. That is China's semiconductor microchip agenda, which has come into play after Trump banned the sale of $290 billion worth of semiconductors to the Chinese. And that is why they want Taiwan. They don't want Taiwan for the territory. They want Taiwan's TSMC, which is the world's largest semiconductor making company in the world. And they are down to nano 3, nano 2, whereas the others are still struggling with nano 8, nano 10. हम तो वहाँ पहुँचे भी नहीं हैं.
Just changing tack, and as we are coming to sort of some of the close of the questions, the use of economic sanctions and what, are the hardships of inflation, etc., and then use of things like embargo using the SWIFT network. Do you see China, Russia, and maybe even India participating in creating a infrastructure which is independent of the West?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's been doing the rounds that there's the argument. Now, let's try and understand how we've come to where we've come. After Second World War, they created, there's a little town in Britain called Bretton Woods. And they created, some of you bankers would know that, they created the Bretton Woods model. And the Bretton Woods system was essentially that dollars and pound sterling would really be the defining currency for trade worldwide. Pound has kind of been sidelined by the sheer spread of the dollars. And the Chinese find that very, very annoying because that eats into their geostrategic aim to be a very important economic power. So therefore, they are trying to have alternate systems like the renminbi-based system, which is the Chinese currency, or some alternative, which will be an alternative to the dollar-led world trade. But I'm told even now dollar-led world trade is something like 60% of the world's financial transactions or even more. And this model is there in the thinking with Asian Development Bank and various other initiatives. But I'm told, and I'm not an economist, so I'll not go deeper into that, I'm told it will take many, many years for it to come into play. But certainly, with the imposition of the SWIFT sanctions on Russia and the credibility question that it raises about Western institutions where you make investments, that if you make investments and tomorrow your country comes under sanction, then your investment as a banker or a bank or a multi-billionaire that you may be would also come under sanctions, and your good money suddenly becomes bad money. And this has caused a lot of concern among investors all over the world. So there is that. The second thing is China and Russia, fearing that a bad day might be in play, had already been engaging in alternate systems outside of SWIFT. I think there is a Russian bank also whose name is VSB or VFB?
VTB, I think. VTB.
VTB, which does ruble trade with India with rupees. And they are now reviving that documentation for India to continue, and that doesn't come under the SWIFT restrictions. So India to come under arrangements with Russia, which will be rupee-ruble trade. So there are options that are being thought of. People now feel that the faith we rested on America-led financial institutions cannot be misused by America to serve its geopolitical agenda. Russia has certainly not done itself a favor by attacking Ukraine, but the West cannot cover itself with glory for what it's done in the last 70 years. So there are debates and counter debates by more realistic people, and normally woolly-haired academics are given up as hopeless cases. But here I must give credit to the academic institutions that they have done more realistic assessment of what could be the reasons for the conflict. And therefore, there's no one side that can be just blamed entirely. Yes, Russia can be blamed for the humanitarian disaster that is there staring at Ukraine. But how did the disaster come about? There are many in America who are saying that America got it started. First, it did its agenda of regime change in the Middle East, removed Saddam Hussein, Hafiz Assad. He couldn't remove Hafiz Assad, Gaddafi, and others, because the Arab states were propping the Americans up that if their totalitarian systems are more successful than our totalitarian systems, then people will ask for the Arab sheikhs to go. So therefore, get them out of the way. Now, here there is a model that, the West always needs an enemy figure. So for the moment is Vladimir Putin. Next will be who, I don't know. But certainly Mr. Xi Jinping is very close there, as to come in as number 2 or number 3. So therefore, there are a lot of questions that need to be answered, and they'll never be answered in public domain by politicians of leading countries. They'll be answered in books that people write, and sometimes when these things don't show them in good light, those books get bought out or put outside the bookstores and get done away with. Fortunately, my book on China has not met that kind of sanction, because I'm told Army headquarters has recommended it to all units to buy a copy, because an Army headquarters, very particular about every line that is written on the maps and numbers and everything. Where not one thing can have their approval which is historically or technically wrong. I'd given General Bipin Rawat a copy of the book.
You mentioned that. Yeah.
So to that extent, I'm lucky. Thank you very much. I'd given General Rawat the copy of the book to release, and he told me that let me get it checked out. So I got a call from one colonel in MO1. MO1 deals with China, and said, "Sir, I just want to tell you, I've read your book twice. I can't find a fault." So thank you very much.
Sure. So, sir, this is and this is the standard question which we ask all our speakers, the last question. And you, I think, while showing the map, almost alluded to it, saying, "वो सब उधर है, वहाँ है, हम तो यहाँ विले पार्ले में." This society, this group, this set of people, what should we take of this war, and what should we learn of this war, and anything that we should do after this?
It's a tough question, but there are a lot of lessons to be learned. I think the most important thing is that we should all work towards creating a narrative in the country that encourages our leaders to play up on India's existing strengths and use that to project India to the international community. That, you talk of human rights, we have always respected human rights. You talk of integration of cultures and people, America is the melting pot of cultures. We are like America, we are also an idea. And therefore, what is it that the West can take from us? Of course, some of the initiatives of the Prime Minister have done well, like yoga and others. But there's a lot more we can offer to the world. And I think we should use our energies to work in that direction by creating small initiative and not just forwarding WhatsApp messages. And finally, and most importantly, I think we should push for a greater role for India in the world. As yet, I think our geostrategic space is between the coast of Africa, that is the eastern coast of Africa, and the western parts of Southeast Asia, that's the Strait of Malacca. That's really a geostrategic space. And south of Sri Lanka, right north of the Himalayas, that's our ability to make a difference. So we have to get our countrymen to realize that we shouldn't waste all our energy only in trying to preoccupy ourselves with who wins the next election. But we should preoccupy ourselves with how can we use the chemistry that is within India to project a model to the world that this is the country you should come to to engage with, to invest in, to see further growth. Japan has got that trick. That's why it's invested over $40 billion in India. Europe is trying to get that. America will only come in with intentions to make profits. So you have to be clear. Just because your children wear caps with NYC written on them, don't get carried away. There's a lot more that about America that you need to understand how the deep state in America works. And the last point, which I must say, I forgot to mention that, we tend to say that America and others are sermonizing us, that, we cannot allow invasion to take place, we cannot allow Russia to get away with. I want us to start raising questions at every forum to ask America, what did you do to clip Pakistan's wings for sponsoring terror? If you had put half your energy into that, Pakistan would have abandoned terror by now. But you sleep with the Pakistanis given half a chance. And then you tell us that you engage with us as long-term strategic partners. Did you stop Pakistani generals from entering US? Did you stop giving visas to generals' children and their parents for education and medical facilities? Don't burden only the Pakistanis. Wo to pyada hai. The kingmakers and the kings of the game are the deep state of Pakistan, that's the Pakistani military, which must keep hostility with India to keep its own toast buttered. Is America doing enough on that? It hasn't. It went into Afghanistan to fight the spread of global terror. But damn it, you created the Al-Qaeda. Now you're going to fight them because, like John Simpson said, the West likes to fight winnable wars against winnable enemies. They lost there, that shows their strategic limitations, just like Russia went in to fight a war with a winnable enemy and they again got caught up in the quicksand of time. So these are questions that we must raise. China to Bharat Sarkar samal legi. Don't worry. And there are those romantics who say boycott Chinese products and all. I'd also like to, but ask yourself, can your driver manage without a cheap Chinese phone? If he can't, how will you call him on time when you're standing here waiting in that parking mein jaun dhoop mein? Right? I'm not advocating Chinese product, but your pharmaceuticals 92%, your computer products over 90%, your air conditioners, LG is in every building, maybe in some of these buildings also, right? Everywhere Chinese products are there. And you have to grant China that. They will get a product delivered to your specifications at the cheapest available rate. You want to take on the Chinas, enhance your own production. There are a lot of businessmen in India who tell me that how can we enhance the thing because all our parts and all come from China only. So it's not the full-fledged LG air conditioner or the TV screen or phone. Everything you assemble comes from China. So you have to step up those things. There's one thing, as I said, there is a difference between rhetoric and reality. So don't thump your chest where you can't deliver.
Thank you so much, sir. Thanks a lot. What an enlightening talk it was, Maroof ji. Thank you so much. Thanks. Maroof ji, you already had a very large persona when we used to see you on TV, and then a couple of weeks back, I met you in person. I literally had to look up like this. So, your physical persona was also like that. But as one would say, after today's talk, we're going to always be left with a much, much larger than life persona about you. हमारे ज़हन में आपकी छवि बहुत ज़्यादा बड़ी हो गई है. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. For such a complex topic, I think the Prabodhan audience is really fortunate that they got a speaker like you. And as we are coming back to this sort of in-person agenda, I think we couldn't have found a better topic and a better person to speak to us. So a very big thank you, sir. I know you've been having a very hectic schedule. You used to always tell me, call me after an X point of time because you were literally back-to-back in so many activities. So again, thanks a lot. I'll just take a couple of minutes to propose our vote of thanks. Thanks to the BMC for this hall, Shri Tendulkar and Sairaj Publicity for the posters and the backdrop, Vastu Shobha for the stage decorations, Avinash Paradkar ji for sound and videographer. As always, a big thank you to Parag Aravani ji and Abhijit Saman ji, our elected representatives of Parla. They're always here. Thank you for being here with us. And of course, since we started crowdfunding, our 200 plus donors, of whom, like I said, 60 have made repeat donations. The biggest thank you that after starting this in-person event, we today again have 600 plus people in this hall. So to our audience, a very, very big thank you. After a short break, Dr. Maroof Raza will be back on stage to autograph the books for those of you who bought them. Friends, let us all hope that we can get such opportunities to interact, and we at Prabodhan Mancha will be absolutely eager to come back again with something which is as topical. Till then, stay safe, stay healthy, and take care. And we'll close this part of the program with a rendition of Vande Mataram.